Have you ever wondered if a single act of kindness could change everything about your life? Sometimes what seems like an ordinary moment, a small decision to help someone in need, can set off a chain of events that leads to unimaginable consequences. This story is about one man's choice to lend a hand and how it brought an unexpected visitor to his doorstep, changing the course of his life forever. Meet Elijah Turner, a modest, hard-working man who found contentment in the simplicity of life. In a small town where everyone knew each other by name, Elijah was known for his quiet generosity and the warmth he brought to his neighbors. He worked as a maintenance technician at a local community center, a job he found fulfilling despite its modesty. Elijah never asked for anything more than he needed, and was always ready to lend a helping hand to anyone who needed it. No questions asked. But one evening, that selfless trait of his would be the very thing that led him down a path he never anticipated. It was a calm, quiet evening as Elijah drove home from work along a narrow, winding road that led out of town. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the fields and trees. Just as he rounded a bend, he noticed something unusual: a car, parked on the side of the road, hazard lights blinking in the dimming light. Instinctively, Elijah slowed his truck to a stop. Inside the car was a woman, her face a mix of relief and tension as he approached. She was struggling with a flat tire, clearly distressed and unsure of what to do. Without a second thought, Elijah offered to help. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice calm and friendly. The woman nodded gratefully, explaining that she didn't know how to change the tire herself. Elijah got to work, lifting the car with the jack and loosening the lug nuts with practiced ease. As he worked, the woman, who introduced herself as Sarah, thanked him profusely, admitting she'd been trying to figure it out on her own, but had no luck. Elijah brushed off her gratitude with a humble smile, saying it was no trouble at all. In just a few minutes, the tire was changed, and Sarah was back on the road, her anxiety replaced by gratitude. Elijah watched her drive off into the distance, feeling satisfied that he'd helped someone in need. To him, it was just another good deed, one of many small acts of kindness he performed without a second thought. But this time, things would be different. The next morning, Elijah's day began like any other. He made his coffee, took a quiet moment to watch the sunrise, and prepared for his day. But as he stepped outside to head to work, he noticed something peculiar parked just down the street: a sleek black SUV with tinted windows. At first he thought nothing of it. After all, cars came and went on his quiet street. But as he got into his truck and started his drive to work, he couldn't shake the feeling that the SUV's presence wasn't just a coincidence. Throughout the day, the image of the SUV lingered in Elijah's mind. When he left work that evening, there it was again, parked at the end of his street, still and silent. By the third day, the SUV had become an unsettling fixture in his routine, waiting quietly each morning and evening. Elijah began to wonder, who were they, and why were they watching him? What he didn't know yet was that his one act of kindness, his decision to help a stranger on the side of the road, had set off a ripple effect far beyond his understanding. Soon Elijah would come to realize that this was no ordinary SUV, and the people inside it weren't just anyone. This mysterious presence would soon drag him into a world of hidden motives, surprising revelations, and choices that would test every value he held dear. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories with unexpected twists, where ordinary choices lead to extraordinary consequences, don't forget to subscribe. Today we follow Elijah's journey to uncover the truth behind this shadow in his life, a shadow that would reveal far more than he ever bargained for. Imagine a small town where time seems to move a little slower, where everyone greets each other by name, and where a gentle calm fills the air. This is Brooksville, a close-knit community tucked away from the rush and noise of big city life. The streets are lined with cozy homes, each one bearing signs of care and familiarity: a swing on a porch, flower pots brimming with marigolds, and the comforting sound of distant chatter as neighbors share news over fences. Brooksville may be quiet, but for Elijah Turner, it's home. Here, he's not just another face, he's the friendly soul people wave to in passing, and the one who's always ready to lend a helping hand. Elijah, at 35, has crafted a life of simplicity and contentment. His modest house, located on the town's edge, is a single-story home he inherited from his parents, who passed down not only their property but their values of kindness and humility. The house itself is a modest structure, its white-painted walls weathered by years, but lovingly maintained. Out front, an oak tree spreads its branches, casting shade over the porch, where Elijah starts each day with his morning coffee. It's his favorite time, a quiet moment before the world wakes up, when the light is soft and the air is cool. Elijah's mornings follow a comforting rhythm. He wakes before dawn, relishing the peace of the early hours. After a quick shower, he brews his coffee, savoring its warmth as he sits on the porch, watching the sun rise over the trees. He takes a deep breath, the earthy scent of morning dew blending with the faint fragrance of wildflowers from his garden. To Elijah, this moment is grounding. It's a reminder of the simple joys he holds dear. After his coffee, Elijah heads into town, always stopping at the local diner for breakfast. The diner, a well-loved Brooksville establishment, is a lively hub where people gather to chat and catch up. Mrs. Jenkins, the diner's longtime waitress, knows his order by heart: a plate of scrambled eggs, toast, and a side of bacon. As he takes his seat by the window, she greets him with a warm smile and a friendly "Morning, Elijah." They chat as he eats, talking about town gossip, weather predictions, and whatever small happenings have stirred the local conversation. Elijah enjoys these little moments of connection. They remind him that he's part of something larger, a community that cares. From the diner, Elijah heads to his job as a maintenance technician at Brooksville's community center. It's not the most glamorous job, but to Elijah, it's fulfilling work that lets him help others. He's the one people call when something needs fixing, whether it's a leaky faucet, a door off its hinges, or a burst pipe. Elijah takes pride in his work, finding satisfaction in knowing he's making life easier for those around him. His co-workers respect him not just for his skill but for his unassuming, steady presence. There's a calm reliability to Elijah. He's the kind of person who can handle a crisis without losing his cool, a quality that makes him invaluable to the community center staff and visitors alike. But Elijah's commitment to helping others goes beyond his job. He's always willing to go out of his way for anyone in need, no questions asked. To him, kindness is a natural part of life, a value his parents instilled in him from a young age. It's in the little things he does, offering to mow his elderly neighbor's lawn, carrying groceries for the mother with her hands full, or stopping by the local school to fix playground equipment for the kids. Elijah's generosity is subtle, woven into his daily routine in ways that often go unnoticed but are deeply felt by those around him. In Elijah's life, relationships are a cornerstone. While he doesn't have a large circle, he treasures the bonds he shares with a few close friends and family members. His sister, Angela, lives in a nearby town and visits frequently, bringing her lively children who fill his home with laughter and energy. Angela is his confidante and cheerleader, often reminding him of his worth when he doubts himself. Elijah finds joy in being an uncle, and the love he has for Angela and her children brings a warmth to his life that he cherishes. Then there's Derek, Elijah's childhood friend, who's been like a brother to him for as long as he can remember. Derek is everything Elijah is not: outgoing, quick-witted, and full of big ideas. While Elijah finds contentment in the familiar, Derek is always talking about new plans and possibilities, often trying to convince Elijah to join him on his latest adventure, whether it's a fishing trip or a charity event. Despite their differences, the two share a bond that's unshakable, built on years of shared experiences and mutual respect. Derek has a knack for bringing Elijah out of his shell, pushing him to try new things and see the world from different angles. One person who holds a special place in Elijah's heart is his Aunt Clara, a wise, gentle woman who raised him and Angela after their parents passed away. Clara lives a few blocks away in a house filled with books, plants, and the scent of lavender. She's a steady presence in Elijah's life, always offering advice and a listening ear. She taught him the importance of kindness, humility, and integrity, values that have become the foundation of his character. Clara is the person Elijah turns to when he needs guidance or reassurance, and her wisdom has shaped much of who he is. At the end of each day, Elijah returns to his quiet home, where he unwinds with a good book or a rerun of an old movie. It's a modest life, filled with routine and simplicity, but Elijah wouldn't have it any other way. To him, happiness isn't about wealth or status, it's about the little moments: the sunrise, the laughter of his niece and nephew, the satisfaction of a job well done, and the knowledge that he's done right by others. In Brooksville, Elijah is more than just a man who fixes things. He's a beloved member of the community, someone people look up to and trust. His life may be unassuming, but his impact is felt by everyone who crosses his path. He's a constant source of kindness and dependability, and it's this very nature that would soon draw him into a situation far beyond his imagination. And so Elijah's days go by, each one blending into the next, in a way that feels both comforting and secure. But fate has a way of surprising us, often when we least expect it. Little does Elijah know that his life, so firmly grounded in simplicity and routine, is about to be upended by a single act of kindness, a choice that will set off a ripple effect he could never have anticipated. As we venture into this remarkable story, we'll see how Elijah's quiet strength and unwavering kindness become his greatest assets and, perhaps, his greatest challenge. Imagine facing a situation where one simple act changes everything you know. For Elijah, that moment began on an ordinary drive home. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the winding roads that led out of Brooksville. The evening was quiet, the only sounds being the hum of Elijah's truck engine and the faint rustling of leaves in the autumn breeze. To Elijah, it was a peaceful end to a long day, a chance to unwind before reaching the familiar comforts of his small, tidy home. But as he rounded a sharp bend, he noticed something unusual up ahead. A car pulled over on the side of the road, hazard lights blinking dimly in the growing darkness. Slowing down, he saw a woman standing beside the vehicle, her arms wrapped around herself, looking every bit as stranded as she must have felt. Elijah didn't need to think twice. He pulled over, his instincts taking over as he turned off his engine and stepped out of his truck. "Ma'am, do you need some help?" he called, approaching the distressed woman. She looked up, a mix of relief and anxiety in her expression. She appeared young, in her late 20s, with blonde hair pulled back in a hurried ponytail. Her clothes, a pencil skirt and a slightly wrinkled blouse, told Elijah she'd probably come from a long day at work. Her eyes, however, held a trace of something he couldn't quite place: an edge of worry, maybe even fear. "Yes, please," she replied, her voice shaky. "I got a flat tire, and I don't know how to change it." She gestured to the car, where a spare tire lay near the front bumper, along with a jack she'd tried and failed to use. "Not to worry," Elijah said, giving her a reassuring nod. "I'll take care of it for you. Name's Elijah, by the way." "Thank you, Elijah," she responded, sounding genuinely grateful. "I'm Jessica Carter." He nodded, setting to work, hands deftly loosening lug nuts and positioning the jack with practiced ease. As he worked, Elijah could feel Jessica's gaze fixed on him, and he noticed the way she kept glancing over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the darkening road as if she expected someone or something to appear. Trying to ease her discomfort, he struck up some small talk. "Long day?" he asked, hoping to draw her out of her tense silence. She hesitated, then nodded. "You could say that. I'm new to the area and, well, I guess I just wasn't prepared for a night like this." "Brooksville's a friendly place," Elijah replied. "Good folks here. You'll get used to it." Jessica tried to smile, but the worry never left her eyes. "I hope so," she murmured, her gaze flitting nervously down the road. Elijah felt a twinge of unease but shook it off. Maybe she'd just had a rough day. Within minutes, he had the new tire in place and was tightening the lug nuts. As he lowered the jack and packed up the tools, he turned back to Jessica, who now looked more relieved than anxious. "All set. You're good to go," he said, brushing his hands off. Jessica breathed a sigh of relief, her shoulders visibly relaxing. "Thank you, Elijah. I don't know what I would have done without you." Elijah just smiled, waving her thanks away. "No problem at all. Just happy to help." She reached into her purse, pulling out a small notepad and scribbling something down before handing it to him. "Here's my number if you ever need anything, please call. I owe you one." He chuckled, taking the piece of paper and tucking it into his pocket without a second thought. "Glad to have helped. Take care now, Jessica." With a final grateful nod, Jessica got back into her car, and Elijah watched as her taillights disappeared down the winding road. He shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. Just another good deed in his book. The incident might have ended there, but the following morning, Elijah awoke to an unsettling sight. As he stepped out onto his front porch, coffee in hand, he noticed an unfamiliar car parked across the street, a sleek black SUV, polished to a shine, with tinted windows that gave it an imposing, almost foreboding presence. Elijah frowned, squinting at the vehicle. In Brooksville, it wasn't unusual to see the same faces and the same cars every day. This SUV, however, was different, a sharp contrast against the usual pickups and minivans of his neighborhood. He took a cautious sip of coffee, trying to shake off the unease settling in his chest. "Probably someone visiting a neighbor," he muttered to himself, trying to dismiss his concerns. But as the day wore on, the SUV remained in its spot, unmoving, its dark windows like eyes watching his every move. Elijah couldn't help but glance at it from time to time, his curiosity slowly giving way to suspicion. By evening, the vehicle was still there, its silent presence becoming an unwelcome shadow over his otherwise peaceful home. The next day, as he left for work, Elijah noticed the SUV again, now parked a few houses down. The pattern continued for days. Each morning, each evening, he'd catch a glimpse of that same black SUV, sometimes across the street, sometimes a block away. It was as if the vehicle was following him, tracking his movements without revealing its purpose. By the end of the week, Elijah's unease had turned into a steady anxiety that gnawed at him. What would you do, he wondered aloud one evening, if something was watching you, silently lurking, yet giving you no clue why? Days turned into a week, and still the black SUV lingered in the shadows of his daily life. Elijah found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, his once peaceful routines disrupted by the vehicle's haunting presence. He debated whether to approach it, to confront whoever was inside, but each time he considered it, a strange reluctance held him back. What if there was more to this than met the eye? What if he was opening a door to something he couldn't control? Finally, on a particularly quiet evening, his curiosity won out. Gathering his resolve, Elijah took a deep breath and stepped outside, his footsteps echoing in the stillness as he made his way toward the SUV. But as he neared it, the engine suddenly roared to life, and before he could reach the driver's window, the SUV sped off, disappearing down the street in a flash. Elijah stood there, staring after the retreating vehicle, his heart pounding. This was no coincidence. Someone was watching him. But who and why? Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter, this mysterious presence, was somehow linked to that night on the roadside with Jessica. As he made his way back to his house, questions whirled in his mind. Who would go to such lengths to follow him? And why now, just days after he'd stopped to help a stranger in need? Elijah's life, once so steady and predictable, was now tinged with an unsettling mystery. As he lay in bed that night, sleep evaded him. Every sound, every shadow seemed to hold new meaning, as though the quiet safety he'd known his whole life was slipping away. In his heart, he knew this was only the beginning, the opening chapter to a story he could never have anticipated. Would he be ready to face whatever was coming? And how would he respond when the answers he sought were finally revealed? As he drifted off, one final question haunted him: just how far would one act of kindness take him, and at what cost? As the days turned into weeks, Elijah's quiet life seemed to unravel bit by bit, each piece slipping further from the stability he'd once known. The black SUV became a constant presence, hovering on the edges of his daily routine like a shadow he couldn't shake. It appeared at the grocery store, at the diner where he grabbed his morning coffee, and even outside his workplace. Each time he spotted it, the anxiety that had taken root inside him grew, its tendrils winding tighter around his heart. Elijah was a man who valued his peace, his independence, his simple life. He had never been the type to meddle in others' affairs or seek attention. So as the days passed and the tension mounted, a growing sense of frustration simmered within him. One evening, as he sat alone in his small living room, his thoughts churned, each one louder than the last. What do they want from me, he wondered, clenching his fists. He could feel the questions pressing down on him like a heavy weight, and the quiet of his home, once a refuge, felt suffocating. He remembered Jessica's nervous glances on the roadside, the way she'd seemed almost fearful despite his offer to help. Had there been more to her situation than she let on? And if so, what had he unwittingly gotten himself involved in? The next morning, Elijah resolved to take matters into his own hands. If the SUV wanted to follow him, he'd make it confront him instead. He set out with purpose, driving to the park on the outskirts of town, hoping the isolation would make the driver feel confident enough to show themselves. He pulled into an empty parking lot, turning off the engine and waiting, his heart pounding in his chest. Minutes passed like hours as he sat in silence, his eyes trained on the road. Just as he was about to give up, the unmistakable dark shape of the SUV appeared in his rearview mirror, rolling to a stop a few yards away. This was at the moment to finally confront the shadow that had been haunting him. Elijah climbed out of his truck and walked toward the SUV, his expression a mixture of frustration and determination. He was done with the silence, with the constant lurking. He wanted answers. As he approached, the SUV's tinted window rolled down, revealing a man with a sharp, calculating gaze. He looked to be in his mid-40s, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit. There was something cold and unyielding in his eyes, and Elijah felt a shiver run down his spine as they locked eyes. "You've been following me," Elijah stated bluntly, crossing his arms. "What do you want?" The man regarded him with a faint, almost patronizing smile. "Mr. Thompson, is it?" he asked in a low, even tone. Elijah nodded, his gaze never wavering. "That's right. And I'd like to know who you are and why you're watching me." The man raised an eyebrow, seemingly amused. Let's just say I represent certain interests. Interests that are very aware of what happened between you and MS. Carter. Elijah felt a surge of anger. If you have something to say, then say it. Enough with the games. The man tilted his head, his gaze unwavering. MS Carter is not exactly who you think she is, Mr. Thompson. She's connected to people who value their privacy very highly. When you involved yourself even unintentionally, you opened a door. Now, the question is, are you prepared to face what's on the other side? Elijah's mind raced. What was he talking about? Privacy? Connections? It all seemed like a game to intimidate him. But the man's words left a lingering chill. He had seen Jessica as just another person in need. He hadn't questioned who she was, where she came from, or what secrets she might have carried with her. Look, I don't want any trouble, Elijah replied, his voice firm. I helped her, that's all. I don't need anything else from her or from you. The man gave a slow nod, his expression unreadable. I understand. But trouble, Mr. Thompson, has a way of finding those who don't seek it. He paused, reaching into his jacket to pull out a card. If anything unusual happens, call this number. I suggest you keep it close. Without another word, he rolled the window up and the SUV pulled away, leaving Elijah standing in the empty lot, the card gripped tightly in his hand. Elijah glanced down at it, but the only thing on the card was a phone number, no name, no title, nothing else. Frustrated and more than a little unnerved, Elijah stuffed the card into his pocket. He had a feeling he'd regret ever taking it, but something told him he might need it. Days passed, and though the SUV's presence lessened, it was as if Elijah's world had been permanently altered. The small town of Brooksville, which had once felt warm and familiar, now seemed filled with unseen eyes and silent whispers. He found himself looking over his shoulder, listening to the quiet as if it held secrets waiting to emerge. It wasn't long before another sign of trouble emerged. At the community center where Elijah volunteered, he began noticing small changes. Strangers visiting the usually quiet halls, unfamiliar cars in the parking lot. One evening, as he wrapped up his shift, he overheard two men in the lobby talking in low voices. Their conversation was fragmented, but he caught words that sent a chill down his spine. Surveillance. Target. Jessica Carter. A surge of panic flared in Elijah's chest. He hadn't seen Jessica since that night, but now he was certain she was involved in something far more dangerous than he'd anticipated. He wondered if he should reach out to her, warn her somehow. But how could he do that without risking even greater exposure? The weight of the decision pressed down on him, each option carrying risks he wasn't sure he could face. That night Elijah lay in bed, sleep eluding him as thoughts churned endlessly. Part of him wanted to call the number on the card, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it would only pull him deeper into whatever mess Jessica had left behind. The days that followed only heightened his tension. He started receiving strange calls in the middle of the night, static-filled lines that would cut off as soon as he answered. Once, a low voice muttered something inaudible before the line went dead. He'd also noticed unfamiliar figures lingering in town, men in suits who seemed out of place in Brooksville's laid-back atmosphere. Each encounter chipped away at his peace, his mind whirling with a storm of questions and fears. In the desperate bid for clarity, Elijah reached out to a friend from his past, a retired detective named Greg, who had a knack for uncovering hidden truths. Over a drink one evening, Elijah recounted the entire ordeal, from the roadside encounter to the black SUV and the cryptic man with the card. Greg listened carefully, his gaze thoughtful. When Elijah finished, Greg took a deep breath. "Elijah, I think you're dealing with something a lot bigger than you realize. Jessica, she might be connected to people who operate outside the law. And if they're watching you, it means they think you know something valuable, or that you could be a threat to their plans." Elijah's stomach twisted. "But I don't know anything. I only helped her change a tire." Greg gave him a serious look. "Sometimes that's all it takes to get caught up in something you can't escape. They might think you're lying, or that Jessica told you something you're not even aware of." He paused, his expression grim. "If I were you, I'd tread carefully. These people don't play by the same rules as the rest of us." Elijah felt a surge of despair. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, entangled in a web he couldn't understand. He thanked Greg for his advice and returned home, his mind racing with possibilities. Could he walk away from this, or had he crossed a line that was now impossible to retreat from? His answer came sooner than he expected. Just a few days later, Elijah found an unmarked envelope slipped under his front door. Inside was a photograph of him and Jessica on the roadside, taken from a distance, the moment frozen in eerie clarity. Alongside it was a note, "Stay silent or face the consequences." The photograph sent a shockwave of fear through him. Whoever these people were, they were watching his every move, tracking every moment, and they wanted him to know it. Elijah knew he was in far deeper than he'd ever intended. Every instinct told him to run, to disappear, to escape the invisible chains that had wrapped around his life. But as he stared at the photograph, a newfound resolve hardened within him. He wasn't the type to back down, and he wasn't about to be intimidated by faceless threats. The life he'd built, the values he held dear, none of it was for sale or compromise. He was done running, done looking over his shoulder. However, the choice to stand his ground wouldn't come without cost. The threats grew bolder. His home was vandalized one night, his windows shattered, and a chilling message spray-painted across his front porch, "You were warned." The next day, he found his truck tires slashed, leaving him stranded and frustrated. Elijah's quiet life was unraveling at an alarming pace, each incident a clear warning of the power his unseen enemies held over him. Still, Elijah refused to bow. He contacted Greg again, enlisting his help to uncover who was behind the intimidation tactics. Together, they began together the shadowy network that Jessica was entangled in, a group that operated in the shadows using influence and intimidation to maintain their control. But as Elijah dug deeper, he faced even greater risks, both from those following him and from the doubts clawing at his mind. He questioned himself, wondered if he was in over his head, if the fight was even worth it. Yet each time he considered giving up, he remembered the threats, the invasion of his home, the violation of his life. Elijah knew he couldn't allow fear to drive him into silence. In his heart, he understood that He had to see this through, not just for himself, but for Jessica, for his town, and for the values he believed in. Elijah knew that the journey ahead would only become more treacherous, but he had made his choice. The stakes were high, and his life would never be the same, but for Elijah, there was no turning back now. Just when Elijah thought he was beginning to piece together the puzzle, a shocking revelation shattered everything he thought he knew. It happened on an unassuming afternoon as he returned home after a long meeting with Greg. Elijah had been in the process of narrowing down the potential players in Jessica's shadowy world, meticulously mapping connections and relationships. He'd started to feel as though he was making progress, but as he opened his mailbox and found a familiar-looking letter waiting for him, all sense of certainty slipped through his fingers. The letter was unmarked, save for his name scrawled across the front. Elijah felt a chill as he tore it open, revealing a single sheet of paper with a handwritten message. The words were scrawled hastily, but their meaning hit him with the force of a train. Elijah, they've set you up. Jessica isn't who you think she is. Trust no one. The letter was unsigned, leaving Elijah staring at the words in shock. Every conversation, every action over the past few weeks came rushing back, now cast in a sinister light. Had he been fooled from the beginning? The idea seemed impossible, but the letter left him no room for denial. Jessica, the woman he thought he had helped, the one he had unknowingly risked everything for, might not have been a victim at all. The weight of this possibility fell on him like a storm, each new doubt tearing at the fragile web of trust he'd built in his mind. He thought back to the night he'd met her. The way she'd seemed scared and vulnerable, her desperation palpable as she waited helplessly beside her broken-down car. It had all felt so genuine, so real. But now, he wondered if it had all been a carefully crafted illusion. A baited trap designed to draw him in. As he processed the letter, another unsettling thought crept in. If Jessica had deceived him, then the danger he was in was likely much worse than he'd realized. The SUVs, the men watching his every move, the veiled threats, they all took on new meaning. It was no longer just about helping a stranger in need. Elijah had unwittingly placed himself in the crosshairs of something far more dangerous and calculated. Elijah's mind raced as he tried to untangle the new web of lies before him. He realized he had no idea who could have sent him the letter, but it meant someone out there was aware of his predicament, someone with inside knowledge. For the first time, Elijah wondered if Greg might have suspicions he hadn't shared, or perhaps it was someone from Jessica's world, someone who wanted him to know the truth, but couldn't reveal themselves directly. That night, Elijah found himself sitting alone in his darkened living room, the letter on the table in front of him. His gaze remained fixed on it as questions spiraled through his mind, each one more pressing than the last. Who could he trust? How could he move forward? And what on earth did Jessica want from him? The sense of betrayal ran deep, tugging at memories he'd long kept buried. Elijah had always believed in helping others, always believed in the simple value of kindness, but now those beliefs felt twisted and weaponized against him. Determined to confront the situation head-on, Elijah decided he couldn't just sit in his own doubts. He needed answers. The following day, he reached out to Greg, asking him to meet at their usual diner. As he sat across from Greg, watching his friend's face for any sign of deception, Elijah carefully chose his words, hoping to draw out the truth without revealing too much. "Greg," Elijah began, folding his hands on the table, "I've been getting strange messages lately. Something's not right about this whole thing with Jessica. I think someone set me up." Greg's eyes flickered with a mixture of surprise and concern. What do you mean, set you up? Are you saying she was involved in this from the start? Elijah nodded slowly, gauging Greg's reaction. "It seems that way. I don't know who sent the message, but it was clear. And Jessica isn't who I thought she was, and now I'm caught up in something I can't even begin to understand." Greg leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "Elijah, you're saying she manipulated you into helping her? That she planned all of this?" "Yes," Elijah replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "And if that's true, then everything I've done, every risk I've taken, was based on a lie." Greg's brow furrowed as he considered this new information. This changes things. If she's involved, then she might have ties to the same people who've been watching you. They could be using her to control the situation, or worse, to draw you further in. Elijah nodded, feeling the weight of Greg's words. But even as he listened, he couldn't help but wonder if Greg himself was part of the deception. Paranoia seeped into his thoughts, each word Greg spoke twisting into potential betrayal. Elijah's gaze drifted to the window, the world outside blurred by his mounting sense of dread. His own reflection looked back at him, weary and uncertain, a stark reminder of how much he'd changed since this nightmare had begun. As he parted ways with Greg, Elijah knew he needed a new plan. He was determined to confront Jessica herself, but with each step, the stakes seemed to rise, the dangers multiplying as he walked deeper into the unknown. He found himself standing outside Jessica's last known address, a modest apartment complex on the edge of town. The sight of it felt surreal, a stark contrast to the mystery and danger that had consumed his life. Elijah took a deep breath, steeling himself before knocking on her door. A tense moment passed before Jessica opened it, her face a mixture of surprise and alarm. "Elijah, what are you doing here?" Her expression only fueled his suspicions, and he found himself speaking before he'd fully gathered his thoughts. "I need to know the truth, Jessica. Who are you really, and why did you involve me in this?" Jessica's face paled, her eyes flickering with an emotion Elijah couldn't quite decipher. She opened the door wider, motioning for him to come inside. Once they were seated, she took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "Ilya, I'm sorry," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "I never wanted to lie to you, but you have to understand, I didn't have a choice." Elijah's heart pounded as he listened, his mind racing. Jessica revealed that she was indeed connected to a powerful organization, one that operated in the shadows, manipulating people and events to their advantage. She had been on the run, seeking a way out, and in a moment of desperation she had used Elijah's kindness as her means of escape. "But why me?" Elijah asked, his voice a mixture of anger and confusion. "I was just a stranger trying to help." Jessica looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "Because they watch me, Elijah. They watch everyone I come into contact with. And I thought, if you helped me, they'd leave me alone. I thought they'd see it as a sign that I wasn't a threat." The room fell silent as Elijah absorbed her words. The truth cut deep, mingling with the hurt and betrayal that had taken root within him. He realized now that he'd been a pawn in her game, used to shield her from the danger she'd invited into his life. "You're putting me in danger, Jessica," he said, his voice steady but laced with hurt. "You let me believe you were someone you weren't, also you could protect yourself." Jessica's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Elijah saw a glimpse of the person he'd thought she was. A vulnerable, desperate woman caught in a web of deceit. But he couldn't ignore the deception, the manipulation, or the very real risks he now faced because of her actions. "I'm sorry," Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. "I never meant for you to get hurt. I didn't know what else to do." Elijah stood, his resolve hardening. "I don't know if I can trust you, Jessica. You dragged me into this mess without a second thought, and now I have no idea what's real and what isn't." With that, he left, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed in the quiet hallway. Outside, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything he'd just learned pressing down on him. His world had shifted once again. The lines between friend and foe, truth and deception, blurred beyond recognition. As Elijah walked away from Jessica's apartment, he knew his journey was far from over. He would need to decide how far he was willing to go to uncover the truth, and what he was willing to risk to see it through. Now, the question weighed on him heavily. How much more could he endure, knowing that every step forward would plunge him further into a world of danger and betrayal? And would he ever find his way back to the life he once knew? Or was he destined to be forever changed by the choices he'd made? As Elijah moved further into the tangled web Jessica had drawn him into, he found himself grappling with questions that tore at his very foundation. His every instinct told him to walk away, to retreat back to the safety of his routine life and abandon this spiral of secrets. But something about Jessica's haunted eyes, the desperation in her voice, made it impossible for him to turn his back entirely. The risk and deceit gnawed at him, leaving him uncertain, worn, and on edge, yet his resolve to find answers only hardened. Each day presented new challenges that forced him to confront not only the external threats but the conflict within himself. Was he risking his life for someone who had deceived him from the start? Would the man he aspired to be help someone despite betrayal? Or had this journey revealed his weakness, an inability to sever ties, even when it endangered him? Days after his confrontation with Jessica, Elijah began to notice small but unsettling shifts in his everyday life. The black SUV that had once kept its distance now seemed to follow him closer, its silent presence haunting every corner he turned. Phone calls from unknown numbers became frequent, the line often silent or filled with soft static. Elijah's nights were restless, his thoughts consumed by the feeling of being watched. He barely slept, his mind racing with doubt, mistrust, and a creeping paranoia that eroded any sense of peace. One afternoon, as Elijah returned to his car after a quick trip to the store, he noticed a man standing nearby, watching him intently. The man was tall, with a face that might have been forgettable if it weren't for the sharpness in his gaze. Elijah paused, his fingers tightening around his car keys, waiting to see if the stranger would approach. After a few tense moments, the man walked away without a word, but the encounter left Elijah shaken. Were they monitoring him more openly now? Was this their way of reminding him that his every move was under their control? As he got into his car, his hands shook. Elijah tried to steady his breath, but he couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that had settled over him. It wasn't just his safety on the line anymore. It was his sense of autonomy, his ability to trust anyone, even himself. That night, as he lay in bed, Elijah's mind replayed every decision he had made since helping Jessica, tracing the path that had led him here. He could see how, step by step, he had moved deeper into her world, each choice seeming reasonable at the time, but leading him further from the life he once knew. The stakes had escalated beyond anything he had anticipated, and now he was faced with an impossible choice: to cut ties and risk never knowing the truth, or to dive even deeper at the risk of everything. The following day, Elijah decided to confront his fears head-on. He drove to Jessica's apartment, hoping for clarity. But when he arrived, he found the door open, the room dark and eerily silent. A wave of panic swept over him as he stepped inside, the faint scent of stale coffee and paper lingering in the air. Jessica's apartment was empty, save for a small note left on the kitchen counter. It was written in the same hurried scrawl as the letter he had received. "Elijah, if you're reading this, I can't stay here anymore. I've put you in too much danger already. Trust no one." The note ended abruptly, as if she'd been interrupted, leaving Elijah with more questions than answers. Anger simmered beneath his fear, mingling with frustration and betrayal. Once again, he was left in the dark. His only lead vanished. He couldn't decide if Jessica's departure was a cowardly escape or a genuine attempt to protect him. But either way, he was left with a grim realization. He was alone in this. Days turned into weeks, each one filled with escalating tension. Elijah began to see shadows everywhere, threats lurking behind every friendly face. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, taking a toll on his mind and body. His work suffered. His friends began to notice his agitation and paranoia. He started avoiding places he once frequented, choosing instead to move in secrecy, watching his back at every turn. One night, unable to sleep, Elijah found himself pacing his living room, his mind racing with the moral quandary that plagued him. What was he fighting for? Was it his sense of justice? His loyalty to the truth? Or had his need for answers become an obsession, one that was driving him to self-destruction? He felt trapped, caught between the fear of walking away and the fear of seeing this to the end. As he wrestled with these questions, a sudden knock at the door startled him. His heart pounded as he peered through the peephole to see Greg standing outside, his face drawn and weary. Elijah hesitated before opening the door, wary of even his closest friend. "Elijah," Greg began softly, stepping into the apartment, "I'm worried about you. Everyone is. You've changed and we can all see it. Whatever's going on with Jessica, is it worth losing yourself?" Elijah closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping as he felt the weight of Greg's words. He wanted to tell his friend everything, to spill the entire story and unburden himself. But he hesitated, unable to ignore the possibility that even Greg might be compromised. After all, trust had become a luxury he couldn't afford. "I just need to see this through," Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know what I'm looking for anymore, but I can't walk away." Greg's expression softened, and he placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Just don't lose yourself in the process. You're better than this, Elijah. You're stronger." As Greg left, Elijah found himself standing alone in the quiet darkness, the tension building within him like a storm. He had been given an out, a chance to walk away from the chaos and reclaim his life. But the desire for truth, for closure, kept pulling him forward. In the days that followed, Elijah threw himself deeper into his investigation. He pored over every detail he could remember about Jessica, searching for any clue that might lead him closer to the truth. His health began to deteriorate, the stress manifesting as sleepless nights and constant tension. His once trimmed beard grew unruly, and dark circles marred his eyes, giving him a haunted look. Even his closest friends began to distance themselves, unable to reach the man who had once been their dependable friend. The more Elijah uncovered, the more dangerous the game became. He found himself tangled in a web of corruption that reached far beyond Jessica's initial claims. It became clear that powerful forces were at play, forces that would stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden. Elijah's every move was met with obstacles, and he found himself questioning his every action, his every motive. Was he risking his life for justice, or had he simply become addicted to the thrill of the chase? One night, exhausted and desperate, Elijah found himself back at the diner where he and Jessica had once met. He sat at their old booth, staring at his reflection in the window, lost in thought. As he traced his fingers along the edge of his coffee cup, he realized just how far he had fallen from the man he once was. The principles that had once guided him, honesty, integrity, compassion, had been overshadowed by suspicion and fear. He had crossed lines he'd once sworn to uphold, all in pursuit of a truth that might not even exist. At that moment, he faced his darkest dilemma. He could walk away, leave the investigation behind and try to rebuild his life, or he could continue down the path he'd chosen, knowing it might consume him entirely. It was a choice between saving himself and pursuing an answer he might never find. As the hours passed, Elijah sat in silent reflection, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He realized that the journey he was on wasn't just about Jessica or the secrets she held. It was about his own struggle with the world, with his beliefs, and with the man he wanted to be. Finally, he made his decision, the clarity both liberating and terrifying. He would follow the truth wherever it led, but he would do so with a renewed commitment to his values, refusing to let the darkness consume him. But even as he made this promise to himself, Elijah couldn't help but wonder, would he have the strength to hold on to his principles as he faced the unknown? Or would the journey he had chosen ultimately demand more than he was willing to give? Only time would tell, but for now, Elijah stood at the precipice, ready to face whatever came next, even as the shadows around him deepened. And as he left the diner, stepping back into the cold night air, he knew that he would have to find a way to hold on to himself, no matter what the cost. Would you make the same choice, knowing it could destroy everything you value? As Elijah stepped into the dimly lit warehouse, every nerve in his body was taut with anticipation. He was on edge, aware that this moment could define everything he had been struggling toward and possibly destroy him in the process. The air was thick, tinged with the scent of rust and oil, and the faint sounds of machinery echoed in the distance. The shadows seemed to cling to the walls, stretching toward him, adding to the ominous feeling in his gut. He'd been through so much to reach this point, and now, here he was, face to face with the unknown. At the center of the vast room, standing under a single flickering light, was Jessica. She looked different from the last time he'd seen her. The guarded, fearful expression he'd grown accustomed to was replaced with something else entirely. A fierce, almost resigned determination. Behind her, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the man he had glimpsed before, the one he had seen following him and who had haunted his every step in recent weeks. "Elijah," Jessica said, her voice steady but laced with tension. "You didn't have to come here. This doesn't concern you anymore." Elijah clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he looked between her and the man standing silently behind her. "Maybe it doesn't concern me, Jessica, but you involved me the moment you showed up asking for help. You can't just walk away from this now, not after everything." Jessica's expression softened, but the resignation in her eyes only deepened. "You don't understand. If you keep digging, you'll end up like everyone else who's crossed them." A bitter smile tugged at Elijah's lips. "Maybe that's true, but I've already gone too far to turn back now." He took a step closer, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "I want to know the truth, Jessica. I deserve that much. After everything I've risked, everything I've lost, I need to know what all of this was for." The man behind her finally spoke, his voice a low, chilling tone that sent a shiver down Elijah's spine. "Some truths are best left buried, forgotten." Elijah met the man's gaze, his resolve unshaken. "I don't care about the danger. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that living in fear isn't living at all." The man narrowed his eyes, a shadow of a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Bold words, but bravery has its limits, doesn't it?" Jessica looked between them, her face pale but resolute. "Please, Elijah, walk away. This isn't your fight." But Elijah shook his head, his voice firm. "It became my fight the moment I stepped into this mess. I may not understand everything, But I know enough to see that what you're involved in is wrong. And if standing up to it costs me everything, then so be it." A tense silence filled the room as Jessica's companion moved forward, his eyes cold and calculating. "So you're willing to throw your life away for a truth you can't even begin to comprehend?" Elaine's heart pounded, but he refused to back down. I've lost too much to walk away now." The man chuckled darkly. "Very well, but I hope you're prepared for the consequences. So are you saying that if I—" He gestured toward Jessica, a silent command that made her flinch. Reluctantly, she turned toward Elijah, her eyes glistening with an unspoken apology. "I'm sorry, Elijah. I never meant for it to come to this." He looked at her, the betrayal stinging sharper than any physical pain. "So, all of this, all the warnings, all the secrecy, it was all part of their plan." Jessica shook her head, her voice a whisper. "I was trying to protect you, but once you got too close, there was nothing more I could do." Elijah felt his anger flare, a deep sense of frustration mixed with the ache of betrayal. "Protect me? By dragging me into a world of lies and half-truths? By putting me in the crosshairs of people who would do anything to keep their secrets hidden?" Jessica's gaze dropped, her voice barely audible. "I thought I could keep you safe, but I underestimated them." The man stepped forward, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. "How noble. But noble intentions rarely lead to noble endings." Elijah clenched his fists, his voice steady but fierce. "I didn't come here for nobility or heroism. I came for the truth, and if that's going to cost me my life, then at least I'll know I stood for something." The man's eyes narrowed, a flicker of amusement crossing his face. "Very well. If you want the truth so badly, you can have it, but you won't like what you find." He stepped back, giving Jessica a nod. She looked at Elijah, her face filled with regret as she pulled out a small file from her coat pocket, holding it out to him. Elijah's hands trembled as he took it, opening the file to reveal the damning information inside. His heart sank as he skimmed through the pages. Bank records, signed documents, photographs that implicated people he'd never expected. It was worse than he'd imagined. A web of corruption that reached higher and wider than he'd thought possible. For a moment, the weight of the truth threatened to crush him. He had fought so hard, sacrificed so much, and now he saw the depth of the betrayal around him. His life would never be the same, even if he made it out alive. Jessica's voice broke through his thoughts. "Elijah, now that you know, you need to leave. Get as far away from this as you can." But Elijah shook his head, his gaze steely. "No, I've come this far and I'm not backing down now. I'm going to expose this, no matter the cost." The man's eyes darkened, his expression hardening. "Then you've chosen your fate." A tense silence filled the room, the air thick with the knowledge of what was to come. Elijah took a deep breath, steeling himself for the battle ahead. He had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't turn back now. As he looked into Jessica's eyes one last time, he saw the glimmer of remorse and something else, a faint spark of hope. He didn't know what it meant, but he held on to it as he prepared to face the final battle, determined to see his fight for the truth through to the end. And as he took his first step forward, ready to confront whatever lay ahead, he knew that this was it, the point of no return. As the dust settled on the chaos that had consumed Elijah's life, he felt a calm he hadn't experienced in what seemed like an eternity. He stood alone, looking out over the small town that had once felt so familiar and safe, a place he'd thought he understood entirely. But now, with the truth out in the open, and the battle finally behind him, everything seemed both different and deeply precious. In the days following the climax of his journey, Elijah found himself reflecting on everything that had happened and the unexpected ways that it had changed them. He had seen the darkest parts of human ambition and greed, yet he had also witnessed courage, resilience, and the quiet power of those who choose to stand up, even when the odds are stacked against them. For all the hardship, Elijah now understood his own strength and had a newfound respect for the responsibility that came with knowledge and action. One evening, as he walked through the quiet streets, he passed by familiar faces, neighbors, shopkeepers, and friends, each of whom had no idea of the truth he had uncovered. The weight lifted as he realized that, despite everything, these people were safe now, protected from the corruption that had loomed over them. Elijah's work had not been in vain. His sacrifice, the risks he had taken, had shielded those he cared for, even if they would never know. Jessica approached him in those final days, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. She had played her part, albeit reluctantly, in helping him uncover the truth. Her own life had been irreversibly changed as well, and she wore a quiet, thoughtful expression as she faced Elijah, a mutual understanding linking them in ways words could never capture. "I didn't think you'd make it," she confessed, her voice soft with a mix of admiration and regret. Elijah smiled faintly, his eyes softened by forgiveness. "Neither did I. But I think I needed to see it through, to know I did everything I could." They spoke of the past and the future, of second chances and the redemption that often came not with great acts, but with small decisions to do the right thing, one day at a time. As they said goodbye, Elijah felt no bitterness, only a sense of gratitude for having found in her a kindred spirit, someone else who understood the cost of doing what was right. Returning to his humble home, Elijah took in the familiar details with a new appreciation. The creak in the wooden floor, the worn handle on the front door. Each detail held memories and meaning. The home was a simple one, filled with reminders of a life he had once considered mundane. Now, however, he recognized its true value. It was a haven, a place where he could return to after his journey through a world far darker than he'd ever imagined. The experience had not only taught him resilience, but had also made him realize that his life's meaning was not tied to wealth or status, but to the relationships he had built and the quiet, steady acts of kindness he extended to those around him. It was his integrity, his compassion, and his unwavering sense of justice that had carried him through, and he had no intention of leaving those values behind. Months passed, and Elijah's life found a new rhythm, one that honored both his past and the changes he had endured. The people in his town began to notice a subtle shift in him, a depth of insight in his words, a quiet wisdom in his gaze. They knew he had been through something profound, though they could only guess at the details. His friends and family found themselves drawn to his perspective, comforted by his calm strength. One day, a young man who had heard about Elijah's journey approached him, seeking advice on a difficult decision he was grappling with. Elijah listened, offering guidance grounded in empathy and experience. As he spoke, he realized that his journey had not ended. It had merely transformed into something deeper. His role now was to guide others, to share what he had learned and to help those who might one day face the same kind of challenges he had overcome. For all the scars he bore, Elijah had emerged from the darkness not just intact, but strengthened. His heart was full, not with pride, but with the understanding that even the darkest nights can reveal the brightest truths. In the end, he had found not just the answers he sought, but a sense of peace and purpose he could carry forward. As the sun set over the town, casting a warm glow over the streets and buildings, Elijah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his journey fade. The shadows that once haunted him were gone, replaced by a quiet assurance that he had found his way. And as he walked home, he knew that he was no longer alone on the journey. He was part of something larger, a community, a legacy, a quiet but enduring victory over darkness. In that moment, Elijah knew he had been transformed, not by the battles he had fought, but by the strength he had found within himself to face them. And he walked on, carrying forward the hard-won wisdom of his journey, ready to help others find their own light in the darkest of times. In the end, what Sethi's journey teaches us is that sometimes life's greatest challenges are hidden in the simplest acts, the small, everyday choices that, when made with integrity, have the power to reshape not only our own lives, but the lives of those around us. Elijah's story reminds us that even in moments of confusion and adversity, our values and inner strength can guide us through the darkest times. And as he discovered, it's often the quiet persistence, the choice to hold on to kindness and courage, that brings about the most profound change. What can we learn from this journey? Elijah didn't set out to be a hero. He was just an ordinary person, going about his day helping where he could. But that's the remarkable thing. Real courage often doesn't look like grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices. Instead, it's found in the choices we make, day in and day out, to stay true to ourselves. It's the decision to step forward, even when we don't have all the answers, trusting that our intentions will guide us to where we need to be. Elijah's story is also a powerful reminder that every person we encounter, every small action we take, creates ripples far beyond what we can see. He had no idea how one kind act, a simple choice to lend a helping hand, would lead him down a path that would impact not only his life, but also his entire community. And perhaps that's the most inspiring part of this journey, knowing that each of us has the potential to make a difference, even if we don't always see it right away. So, as we close this chapter, let's think about the power we all hold, the potential we each have to bring light into the world. Elijah's transformation shows us that no matter how small we feel, or how insurmountable the odds may seem, we can all make choices that lead to positive change. It's about showing up, staying true to what we believe, and having the courage to keep going, even when the road is uncertain. If you enjoyed this story of resilience and transformation, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing your thoughts below. What choices have you made that led to unexpected outcomes? How did they shape who you are today? Remember, every journey has the power to inspire, and your story might be just what someone else needs to hear. Thank you for joining us, and until next time, keep making choices that reflect the best of who you are. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey with us. Your support means so much, and we're grateful to share these stories that remind us all of the power of kindness, resilience, and transformation. If you enjoyed Elijah's story, please take a moment to like, comment, and let us know your thoughts below. We love hearing from you. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell to stay updated. We have more inspiring stories on the way, filled with twists, turns, and lessons that might just change how you see the world. So stay tuned, and as always, thank you for being here.